Welcome one and all to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 47. Today we're going to be picking up where we left off last lecture, where we started talking about a motif which would become extremely important in the history of Hermeticism. And that's the motif of the Ascent to the Heavens, or, as I've been calling it, the Anabasis motif. There's all kinds of literature in the Corpus Hermeticum, in the Nag Hammadi library, in late antique stuff that we can't get into yet, that's also connected with this motif. So, I figure it would be good to go on reading and rambling about a great variety of precursors to this fascinating literary motif in the mythology of the ancient Mediterranean world. I think most of you know about Joseph Campbell and how in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he talks about how the monomythical, so-called universal hero, who inevitably passes through a stage of apotheosis, that is, divinization or attainment to godhood. Campbell associates this state with the expanded state of consciousness which the archetypical hero experiences after overcoming chaos. It could be you, it could be me, but the point is, it's not everybody. A hero, by definition, is set apart from the world on account of their kleos, their glory. Now, whether I agree with Campbell that there even is such a thing as an ur-myth or a monomyth or a universal hero, and that it's not just a case of him cherry-picking a reconstruction in accordance with his own preset ideals, that's another issue altogether. Same goes with Frazer, Jung, Iliad, and the rest of them. I just want to highlight that there are numerous myths which do contain this apotheosis motif, and a lot more that don't. But it's worth giving some consideration to myths that do, for the sake of context building in the Hermetic worldview. I think when most people think of ascension, they think of Jesus in the book of Acts, or other examples in the Old Testament I described earlier, like Elijah. But it's surprising how many more individuals have been described as ascending toward their gods, whether temporarily or permanently. We're going to focus more today on greco-roman pagan stories than we did last time, though we did prematurely go through Scipio's dream together. Then I'll talk about a few observations in the difference between pagan and Hebrew or Judeo-Christian angles. Okay, so the first example of mine is one of the most well-known examples in antiquity, and it pertains to Heracles, the son of God, of Zeus, that is, the god who cucked Amphitryon, the king of Thebes, by impregnating his wife. Heracles was actually venerated as a full-on god in numerous temples throughout Greece and Italy, and he's best known for his 12 labors, killing lots of monsters, getting the quote-unquote golden apples of the Garden of Hesperides, going to the underworld and back, etc. During Heracles' final adventure, however, he killed the centaur Nessus for trying to rape his wife, Deianira. But with his dying breath, the centaur told Deianira that his blood could serve as a love potion, when in reality it was basically acid, that is, the kind that melts your face, not your mind. Now, believing this love blood would strengthen their relationship, she smeared a cloak with it and gave it to Heracles as a gift. Then, the moment he put the cloak on, it grafted to his skin and his flesh began to burn as if he'd been the victim of one of these horrible acid attacks that we've been seeing going on recently. Now, since he could feel that he was dying and wanted to end the pain, he asked to be taken to the tallest peak of Mount Oiti, just above the city of Delphi, where he could be burnt on a pyre while still alive. So, they get him on the pyre, and they burn him alive. And sure enough, his mortal body perishes, but It's as if his higher spiritual self emerges from the burning body and flutters up into the heavens to be taken up by the gods. Now remember, most people just went to Hades, not Heracles. Heracles was half divine. He had a mortal portion, which suffered and died, and he had a divine portion, which escaped the body and now dwells among the immortals. Well, there would come a time, far removed from mythic time, when this idea would be democratized. Its earliest inklings were probably in Egypt, as the practice initially dedicated to conferring immortality to the pharaohs began to spread among the priests and other elites. Though perhaps the idea was independently developed elsewhere. We can never rule that out. Over centuries, this democratization of divinization trickled down and became the quote-unquote inner divine flame or spark or soul in all mankind, as taught by the Mysteries, the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, the Gnostics, the Stoics, the Christians, etc. But in illo tempore, in mythic time, in the time of Heracles, if everyone was special, nobody was special. And clearly, there was something about Heracles which set him apart from regular mortals. And that's why he got to go up instead of down like everyone else does. So, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, be like him, and maybe the same thing will happen to you. Though let's face it, not even Achilles, who is a demigod, gets spared from the black vaults of Hades. So there must be something really special about Heracles to both the Greeks and the Romans from a very early age. But what we'll see is that he's not the only one who gets let up there for similar reasons, and there are also plenty who get a ticket into heaven for totally different ones. So, being glorious to the point you spill over into the divine world, that was one way of doing things. The Dioscoroi, or the Dioscuri in Latin, these were, to the Greeks, the twin star-crowned gods who manifested themselves to the eye as a phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire. This is like weird-looking electrical discharge that appears on the rigging of ships, foreshadowing relief from a storm. I've even heard one theory that their origins pertain to mushrooms due to some minutiae in their mythology, but I don't really buy it. In any case, they were also known as youthful gods of horsemanship, the guardians of guests and travelers under the protection of Zeus's Xenia, which are the laws that govern guest-host relationships. The myth has it that the twins, that their names are Pollux and Castor, were born as mortal princes. Now, even though they were twins, Pollux, or Polydeuces in Greek, was the son of the Spartan queen Leda, who was impregnated after having been raped by Zeus in the form of a swan. And Castor was the son of her husband, Tyndareus. This is the same Tyndareus as the Oath of Tyndareus, the oath which binds everyone to attack Troy. Polydeuces, being a demigod, was at first the only one offered the gift of divinity and immortality. But he insisted that it be shared with his twin brother, Castor. Now, they were good kids and mighty heroes both and all that, and so, moved by his son's love for his brother, Zeus agreed to share their birthright. But, in order to appease the fates, the twins would have to alternate their time in heaven and the underworld. If you know the story of Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, or even the story of Aragorn and Arwen, which reflects that story, you'll see some common parallels between these myths. There are quite a few stories about the theme of immortality versus mortality in Greek myth, and we'll explore some of those in a bit. But anyhow, the Dioscuri underwent apotheosis and were also placed amongst the stars, and again, in the literal sky. They're placed among the stars as the constellation of Gemini, which just means the twins in Latin. Now, taking this into account, the division of their time between the world above and the world below doubles as a reference to the heavenly cycles, since Gemini is only visible in the sky for half the year. If you're above the horizon, you're in the celestial realm. If you're below the horizon, you're in the underworld. The Egyptians kind of thought the same thing about Set, Horus, and Ra. Now, here's another little story about the mytheme of the gods' immortality versus human mortality. Now, the goddess who destroys her mortal lover is also a mytheme as old as written language itself. According to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, Eos, that is the rosy-fingered dawn Homer is always talking about, she asked Zeus to make her mortal lover Tithonus an immortal. And so he did. But she'd forgotten to ask that he also be granted eternal youth. This is one of those be careful what you wish for stories. Tithonus lived forever, and I quote, "But when loathsome old age pressed full upon him, and he could not move nor lift his limbs, this seemed to her in her heart the best counsel. She laid him in a room, and put to the shining doors. There he babbles endlessly, and no more has strength at all, such as once he had in his supple limbs." Now, in later retellings of this story, Tithonus gets so old that he shrivels smaller and smaller and smaller until he shrivels into a cicada, eternally living but screaming throughout eternity for death to overcome him. So this is a warning story to those mortals who would aspire to immortality or godhood. Could you really handle it? If you weren't born a god, would you just go insane and shrivel into a gibbering insect in the presence of the gods? Probably. Eternal life was not for most Greeks. People got tired. That's why, for many, it was better to go down in a blaze of glory than to live out your old age in peace and quiet. The old Achilles versus Odysseus debate. But I digress. Let's get back to some more instances of divine rapture. Now, here we're going to get some literal rapture going on. Remember, rapture, raptor, rape, all these English words come from the Latin rapere, to snatch away. And though there wasn't intrinsically a sexual connotation to it, in most instances pertaining to the mythology, you bet there's a sexual dimension to it. Or at least that there's some top-down coercion going on from an incalculably different position of power. I don't know what it is about the Greek gods, but they're constantly raping left, right, and center. Male gods abducting female gods abducting male gods abducting male gods in various animal forms, and so on and so forth. This is actually reflected in the Bible with the story with the Nephilim that we talked about last time. Not only that, but gods often end up killing their mortal consorts for some reason. I don't know what it is, but you get this kind of stuff in the Semitic world as well, in sources as early as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Where Gilgamesh rejects the advances of Ishtar/Inanna because she destroys all her lovers. Thing that's weird is that it's often in the form of birds, which is not surprising because birds, especially the big ones, have pretty violent sex lives. To say nothing of, say, eagles' literal mode of foraging food by snatching up animals and dropping them from great heights. I think that the motif goes back into the deep Indo-European and even pre-Indo-European past, where you couldn't just marry somebody from your immediate tribe. So most, if not all, marriages were preceded by a kind of grab-and-bag or a ritualized kidnapping. This kind of stuff even continues to happen to this day in remote parts of Central Asia. Go read about it. It's called bride kidnapping. It's actually more widespread than Central Asia. I can't even begin to enumerate the amount of examples that would support this hypothesis, but it makes for a good project for someone else's dissertation someday, if it hasn't already been done, which it probably has. Sub sole nihil novies. There's nothing new under the sun. Okay, so Ganymede was a handsome Trojan, aka Phrygian, prince who was snatched away to heaven by Zeus in the shape of an eagle. There he's appointed as the quote-unquote cup-bearer of the gods, which is to say a rather euphemistic term for a boy toy. His name is literally a pun with the double meaning gladdening prince and gladdening genitals, based off the Greek words ganumai, gladdening, and medon, or medeon, which are prince or genitals, respectively. I think everybody listening to this knows that the Greeks had a totally different conception of how homosexuality, pedophilia, and so forth were culturally delineated, and this sort of relationship was not to be frowned upon or even uncommon. But if you do a Google image search for Ganymede and Zeus, you might be a little unsettled by some of the results. These would become the kind of artistic themes that just drove the Catholic Church wild for centuries. Not that they're innocent. But anyhow, young Trojan princes are some of the gods' favorite objects of kidnapping. And I imagine it has something to do with the emphasis that Thracian religion had put on ecstatic experiences, as perceived by the Greeks. Remember, Phrygians were of Thracian stock, hence why Greeks and Trojans were mutually intelligible to one another. Ultimately, we again with Ganymede get this Apotheosis story where he becomes a literal constellation in the literal sky as Aquarius, the water bearer. Near to him being his ambrosial mixing cup as the constellation Crater, and the Zeus eagle as the constellation of Aquila. That was a bird screaming in the background. Now, before Antinous was a thing, Ganymede was often depicted to symbolize a kind of god of homosexual love, and thus often appears in artwork playing around with eros, erotic love, and hymneos, marital love. These are all different kinds of love, and there are more. Agape, philos, these kinds of things. In sculpture and mosaic art, he's usually got a shepherd's crook and a Phrygian cap. Another story I want to take a quick look at is that of Ariadne, who was abandoned on the island of Naxos by Theseus on his return to Athens from Crete, after which she was abducted and made immortal by the god of Ecstasy, the god of out-of-body experiences, that's what ecstasy means, Dionysus. Now, there are a handful of versions of her story you can find spread throughout the extant classical literature, but I'm only going to talk about one because it's currently the most well-known one. In this version, Ariadne is the daughter of King Minos of Crete, who betrays her father to assist the Athenian hero Theseus during his quest to slay the Minotaur. She gives him her thread, and he uses it to get back out of the labyrinth. In any case, he repays her by taking her aboard his ship. They take a stop on Naxos, where she falls asleep, and Theseus abandons her. She wakes up, freaks out. I mean, she's a princess who had everything, and now she's abandoned on a deserted island after betraying her family for a man who didn't give a shit about her. It was then that Dionysus came upon her and, quote-unquote, made her his wife. This was a popular scene in classical art. Greek vases often depict Ariadne as the bride of Dionysus, whether feasting with the gods of Olympus, or in more rustic scenes surrounded by raving maenads and satyrs. Now, in a different version, in a, let's say, parallel mythological universe, Ariadne is slain by King Perseus, and Dionysus was to descend into the underworld to rescue her and return her to Olympus. So we get this Orphic catabasis motif also intertwined with this story. I'd like to take a second to speculate on what this entails, however. What does this mean to be abducted by Dionysus, the Zeus of Mount Nysa? Did she commit suicide? Did she ingest some plant trying to survive and had a mystical experience? Did she lament her way into hyperspace? Or perhaps this is more a statement about Dionysus, that he comes like a reaper to take away the world's dejected, lost, and abandoned. There's definitely something going on under this story that echoes the motif of the quote-unquote sacred prostitute, who was ritually given over to the divine bridegroom in numerous permutations of Near Eastern myth and ritual. But in any case, there's a whole lot you can read into a myth like this one, and it's always hard to nigh well impossible to pin down what it meant to the Greeks, because even to them, myths were polysemous. That is, they were multi-layered in their meanings, and not all meanings were evenly apprehended by all. Like I said in the last lecture, there are numerous layers of interpretation, and you can hardly get two people to agree on what, say, the literal meaning of a myth is, what the allegorical meaning is, what the revealed meaning is, or the Marxist interpretation, or whatever. So, to some extent, myths like these will always remain shrouded in mystery, but that doesn't make them any less interesting as repositories of a culture's collective unconscious. Alright, lastly, I think I'm going to discuss Asclepius, because not only does he fit into the Apotheosis mytheme, he also fits into the grand narrative of Hermeticism. One of the most important texts in the Corpus Hermeticum is called To Asclepius, and it's a dialogue between Hermes Trismegistus and Asclepius about the nature of the whole cosmos. It's, if you will, the dialogue between the caduceus and the Asclepian staff. In any case, Asclepius was the son of Apollo, who, as you all know, was the god of healing and plague, music, prophecy, and the sun. Taking after his father, Asclepius was chiefly venerated as a god of drugs and medicine, but also of dreams, prophecies, snakes, healing springs, and that sort of thing. Asclepius's mother had been the mortal Trichaean princess Coronis, who, quote-unquote, died in labor. Id est, she was shot by the arrows of Artemis. As her body was being laid out on a pyre, Apollo, or in some other stories, Hermes, cut the unborn child from her womb, hence the name Asclepios, which means to cut open. Asclepius was raised by the centaur Chiron, who instructed him in the art of mixing drugs and medicines, what with being a forest dweller privy to all its lore. Asclepius grew so skilled in the craft that he eventually found a kind of elixir of immortality by which he could restore the dead to life. And it was this crime against the natural order that led to his demise. It's kind of like Frankenstein. I mean, even Zeus had to ask permission from the fates to overturn death. And that was not in the cards for Apollo's son. And so Zeus destroyed him with a thunderbolt for his hubris. There isn't a Greek tragedy about this incident, but there should be, because it has a real Prometheus Bound vibe to it that I really like. Now, there were two traditions in ancient time as to how Asclepius could return people from the dead, And for this too, I've actually heard some shroomy origin theories that I find in these particular cases interesting based on my own knowledge. One theory is from Carl Ruck, and the other one was from Terence McKenna. According to the one version, Apollodorus's, Asclepius had received Gorgon's blood from Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and this could bring people back from the dead. Carl Ruck seems to think that the whole Gorgon Medusa thing has everything to do with mushroom cultivation rituals. According to another tradition, the one which was discussed by Terence McKenna, Asclepius was shut up in the house of Glaucus, whose name means blue-gray, the color of psilocybin, incidentally. And Asclepius was supposed to cure this Glaucus. Now, while standing around one day, lost in thought as to how he was going to cure Glaucus, there came a serpent which twined itself around his staff, which he promptly killed. Another serpent, however, came carrying in its mouth, quote-unquote, an herb, maybe a fungi, and it used this to resuscitate the other snake, and Asclepius henceforth made use of the same herb with the same effect upon men. Now, fearing lest men might gradually figure out a way to escape death altogether, and getting complaints from Hades that there weren't enough newcomers coming down, Zeus put an end to Asclepius's mortal part. Now, after his death by bolt of glory, Asclepius rose up to the stars and was immortalized among them as the constellation Ophiuchus, the Serpent Holder. Asclepius was often depicted as a kindly, bearded, kind of Pythagorean-looking man holding a staff entwined by a single serpent, and although he's largely absent from vase paintings, his statues are quite common, and even more common are tablets or objects dedicated to him at his holy sites. So, for example, if you broke a leg, you'd have left a mock leg with devotional inscriptions on it, or a mock hand, or mock eyes, or whatever, and you would dedicate this in gratitude for having been healed by the god. Archaeologists find plenty of these. Now, Asclepius was worshipped all over Greece, and many towns claimed the honor of being his birthplace. This is normal, this is typical. Every single village is the home of every single god, it seems. But in any case, his temples were typically built on hills outside of town, out in the fresh air, and near wells which were supposed to have healing powers. Asclepian temples were not just places of worship, but were frequented by great numbers of sick people, and therefore might be considered the earliest hospitals in the world. The chief seat of Asclepius's worship was at Epidaurus, where he had a temple within which no one was allowed to die, and nobody was allowed to give birth. I kind of get a kick out of the idea that you're not allowed to die somewhere, but all right. Now, these kinds of temples, especially at Epidaurus, were filled with living, moving, wriggling, slithering snakes. These were sacred to the worshippers of Asclepius. It's often speculated that it's because they were a symbol of wisdom and regeneration because of the shedding of the skin. But I would argue that it's because snakes were inextricably intertwined in Greek natural philosophy, or just plain folk knowledge, with medicinal plants, to the extent that they thought snakes got their own venom from plants. This isn't true, of course, but it doesn't change the reason behind why, even today, our symbol for healthcare and pharmaceuticals is a serpent-entwined staff. For whatever reason, various kinds of tame serpents, in which Epidaurus abounded, were kept in his temple all over the place. So, what you would do if you were ill is you would go to this temple for an incubation. From what I can gather, you would lay down on a marble floor in some corner of the temple in a room full of free-roaming snakes. You'd be given what I presume to be a preparation of opium. Then you would lay down all night in an opium reverie with snakes crawling all over and around you, and you would have all manner of crazy visions of the god in serpent form or otherwise, and that's how you communed with the healing powers of Asclepius. There were certain rules prescribed by the priests to undertake this ritual, but this is how the remedies for diseases were discovered, in a dream. This sort of stuff continues to this day with shamanic healers. Those whom the gods cured of their diseases offered a sacrifice to him, generally in the form of a cock. This is why when Socrates committed suicide to spite the city of Athens, he said, "I owe a cock to Asclepius," just before he died, as if to say, "Thank you for healing me of the disease that is life, because I'm going to the other side now." These last words are what made Nietzsche despise Plato. But I won't get into this here. I suppose here would be a good place to talk about some stark differences between the Greco-pagan and the Hebrew ideas of Anabasis, or going to heaven, or divine rapture, Apotheosis, or whatnot. Now, when it came to the pagan conception of being brought to Olympus to dine on nectar and ambrosia among the gods, it was either because you were just overwhelmingly glorious, or because the gods wanted to, let's say, come upon you. It's almost a 50-50 split, even though these shouldn't necessarily be thought of in mutually exclusive categories. Some individuals are thought glorious for their deeds, and then others are thought glorious for their beauty. In any case, what's obviously going on is that there's a certain propinquity one gets to the gods in some category or other, and that leads to a sort of rupture of planes. This is an Eliadian term. The interworlds rip open, and the one who is most like the immortals becomes themselves immortal. This sort of modality of thinking inspired people to be godlike in their lives and deeds, and this is another reason there are so many moralizing tales about individuals who thought themselves better than the gods. Folks like Marsyas, who gets flayed alive because he thinks he's a better musician than Apollo. Or Arachne, who gets turned into a spider because she thought she was a better weaver than Athena. It was a fine line to tread. As the Delphic maxims go, know thyself, but likewise nothing in excess, or nothing too much. The Greeks were highly aware of the concept of hubris. Now, in the Hebrew tradition, especially with the prophets in the Old Testament, having a revelation from God is all about their piety and asceticism. Now, when I say piety, what I mean is attention and dutifulness to the laws passed down by God. They are the only righteous men in a sea of lost sheep, at least from their perspective. Now, it's their very denial of the world they live in, their self-abnegation, that triggers their rupture of plane. Now, note how these are the two extremes which the Buddha ultimately rejected. Extreme asceticism and extreme aestheticism. Please be wary of the extreme differences between these two words. despite the fact that they sound so similarly. One has to do with rejecting the body, and the other with enshrining it. The Buddha, however, was not after these kinds of experiences we're talking about. To a Buddha, this is all more maya, more of the phenomenal world. Gods are elevated beings, worthy of respect and dignity, but they are ultimately trapped within samsara, along with all the rest of us. Now, something I want to mention is that it's this Near Eastern tradition, the piety and asceticism one, that won over the West. You can thank the Desert Fathers, you can thank Simeon the Stylite, you can thank St. Augustine, or whoever you'd like, but with time, the pagan ideal of heroic apotheosis was squashed and swept under the rug. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob didn't want to have sex with you. He didn't want you as his quote-unquote cupbearer. He wants you to become like him, to deny desire and to squelch the animal natures in man and be reconciled with his perfection. He didn't reveal himself to great heroes like Heracles or Romulus, but to humble, cud-eating ascetics like Ezekiel. This is why Jesus is born a carpenter and not a prince. No, the God of Abraham revealed himself to the humble, to the lowly, to the slave, or the water maid, to those who conceived of themselves as a thread woven into some greater tapestry, not as some bright shining ego. And for better or for worse, remember, there's an infinity of ways we can look at this historical change, but it was the meek who would inherit the earth, because the strong had their day in the sun, and their time was over. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I don't want to be talking about 4th to 8th century Anno Domini issues when we haven't even come close to the period of said Dominus's life. Still, as we approach the life of Jesus more and more with every lecture, we're getting to see the historical context of his life fleshed out more and more, particularly the competing attitudes, especially between Hellenic and Judaic modes of quote-unquote doing religion. Alright, so finally I need to close with an announcement that some of you may have heard, though most of you probably haven't. I've just been accepted into a PhD program in history, and that'll be starting in September of 2017. My official field, so to speak, will be early modern history, that is Renaissance and Reformation history, that sort of stuff, medieval history, and the quote-unquote history of science. With any luck, these specialties will come in handy looking for a job later on in life. But in any case, if I want to study Hermeticism formally, these are the subjects I would want to take anyways. Remember, Hermeticism was largely a phenomenon pertaining to its reception, particularly during the Renaissance. Now, here's a part of my proposal which I had sent in to describe what I want to work on. So, here I go. My purpose in applying to this program is to advance my study into how the recovery and translation of the Hermetic texts from late antiquity into Renaissance Latin played a role in shaping the evolution of humanism. Hermeticism is an amalgam of Hellenistic, Persian, Babylonian, and Egyptian natural and religious philosophies, which survived among the eccentric fringes of the European and Arabic intellectual traditions throughout the Middle Ages, until taking on its most sophisticated form following the translations and interpretations of the Italian Renaissance intellectuals, Marsilio Ficino, Ludovico Lazzarelli, Francesco Patrizzi, and Giordano Bruno. As a loosely defined system of thought, Hermeticism incorporated a handful of ancient sciences such as alchemy, astrology, medicine, and theurgy. These sciences, despite some of their epistemologically naive assumptions about the physical nature of reality, stand in retrospect as major stepping stones on the path toward modern science. So insofar as alchemy was a laboratory-bound practice centered upon the manipulation of base metals into higher states, it was the direct antecedent of modern chemistry. Astrology, keeping judgments aside regarding its modern uses and abuses, is likewise the forebear of contemporary astronomy, horology, and mathematics. The same may even be said of ancient magic or theurgy, which is, in as much as it was concerned with mapping and altering consciousness, it was in a sense the predecessor of modern depth psychology. Now, with all teleological presumptions aside, however, these unique phenomena were vital to the intellectual richness of the ancient, medieval, and pre-modern world, and so they are thus worthy subjects for deeper historical inquiry in and of themselves. Hermeticism straddled many civilizations across time and space, spanning from Egypt and Greece to the Roman Empire, the medieval Arab world, Renaissance Europe, and beyond. It was a field of research carried out in many languages, and it has been the subject of special interest to many key thinkers throughout history, from Zosimus of Panopolis to Paracelsus and Isaac Newton. It was modern research into Hermeticism which was so critical in revealing the fundamental interconnectedness of all pre-modern science, philosophy, and religion, and the gradual changes which slowly disentangled each of these disciplines from one another over the centuries. So, that's the gist of what I'll be studying over the next 4 years or so, in addition to the usual kind of stuff, that is coursework, TAing, marking, or whatnot. Now, what this means for the Encyclopedia Hermetica series is that it's going to be put on hold indefinitely. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to stop making content, it just means that it's going to slow down and become much tighter and more rigorous. You know, here I tend to just use a few books from my shelf or some websites as a quick reference, then I write up a script as if I were just talking off the cuff. I'm more being here like a librarian than anything. And that's definitely not how I operate within the academic world, where everything I use is either primary source material or material taken from peer-reviewed journals or monographs printed strictly by university presses. There's no digressions, no speculations, no dives into hyperspace. It's just the story that the sources can corroborate. Now, this news may come as a disappointment to some, but alas, it is what it is. I've been working toward this my whole life, and I'm happy to see it finally working out. I don't want to rule out new material entirely, of course. It's just unlikely to be Encyclopedia Hermetica stuff on account of my many new responsibilities working in a university department. Obviously, I'll be doing a lot more reading and writing, so when I do get back at it, I'll have much more to share on the history of Hermeticism, and I'll have books published. I'll be on firmer footing to take up where we left off. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. I'm Dan Attrell. Thank you for listening.